The morning had barely begun when the raven landed on the telephone pole at the edge of the abandoned road. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, the kind that held its breath before deciding whether to rain or simply remain silent for the rest of the day. The fields on either side stretched out in muted colors, patches of yellowed grass bending under the weight of the wind. A long line of old wooden poles marched into the distance, their wires humming faintly, like tired violin strings in the cold air. But when the raven settled on the tallest pole, the sound stopped. The wires, which had always carried a soft vibration from the wind and distant transformers, suddenly went still. No hum, no whisper, no trembling. Only silence, sharp enough to notice. The bird ruffled its feathers, glossy and dark as wet ink, and looked over the empty road with a calm, almost knowing gaze. From the nearby house, a sagging farmhouse with peeling white paint, Marta stepped onto the porch with her morning mug of coffee. She was a woman in her late 50s, with strong hands and a face that carried years of weather and work. Life had taught her to notice small things, the way frost formed on window corners, the way cows grew restless before a storm, the way telephone wires sang in the wind when no one paid attention. Today, they didn't sing. She frowned and leaned forward, squinting. The raven sat perfectly still, its head cocked slightly to the side. Marta knew ravens came and went often. Nothing unusual in that. But something about the silence felt wrong, as if the world were holding a secret and waiting to see who would ask first. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the fence. Gravel crunched under her boots. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. She glanced at the wires overhead. They hung motionless, straight as pencil lines drawn across the sky. Usually they trembled even on calm days. The raven blinked slowly. Its black eyes reflected the muted morning light, flat and unreadable. "You again?" she muttered. She'd seen this particular bird before, or at least she believed it was the same one. There was a notch missing in its right wing, a small triangular gap that made its silhouette distinctive when it flew. It had been coming to that pole for years now, always alone, always quiet. Marta wasn't superstitious, but she'd grown up around people who were. Her grandmother used to say that ravens carried silence with them, that their presence could still a room, a day, even a life. Marta had always taken that as old folklore. Birds were birds. Silence was weather. And yet, a pickup truck rumbled down the road just then, coming toward the farmhouse in a slow crawl. It belonged to Jonas, the farmhand who helped her since her husband passed. He raised a hand in greeting. Marta waved back, but her eyes drifted again toward the pole. The raven was still there, the wires still silent. Jonas parked and stepped out, adjusting his hat. "Morning," he said, walking toward her. "Weather's holding. Maybe we'll get some fence mending done today." "Listen," she said. He did. He tilted his head. "To what?" "To what's not there." He waited, puzzled. Then his brow furrowed. "Huh. The lines aren't humming." "Exactly." They stood there together for a moment, looking at the poles stretching into the distance like the ribs of an old skeleton. The absence of sound felt heavier than sound itself. Jonas scratched his chin. "Transformer out?" "Maybe," Marta said, though she didn't believe it. The electricity worked fine. The lights in her kitchen had flickered on just as always. "It's that bird," Jonas joked, nodding at the raven. "He's putting a curse on your wires." Marta didn't smile. The bird turned its head again, watching them. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the grass, but not moving the wires. Not even a tremble. For the rest of the morning, Marta couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something small, but important. Like a breath held too long. She went about her chores, fed the animals, checked the barn roof, sorted tools. But every so often, she found herself looking toward the telephone pole. The raven never moved, and the wires never sang. By noon, Marta realized something else. The silence wasn't just around the farmhouse. It extended far, stretching across the fields, through the empty road, past the tree line. No distant engine. No bird calls except the quiet shifting of feathers on the pole. No far-off hum of power lines, which for her whole life had been a part of the landscape's invisible backbone. It was as if the world had drawn a circle around that moment, that place. and decided nothing would disturb it. Marta wiped her hands on her jeans, felt the cold creeping into her bones, and stared up at the bird. "Why today?" she whispered. The raven blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if considering the question. And though Marta didn't believe in omens, she suddenly felt the quiet settle deeper. Not threatening, not comforting, just absolute. A quiet that didn't ask, didn't answer, didn't explain. A quiet that would not leave. The next morning broke with a thin metallic light, the kind that made everything look sharper than it needed to be. Marta stepped onto the porch before the kettle had even finished boiling, drawn outside by a feeling she could not name. The grass was wet with dew, the sky low and uncolored, and the old telephone poles stretched along the road like a line of leaning soldiers. The raven was still there, exactly where it had sat the day before, unmoved, unbothered, watching. Marta tightened her coat. She wasn't sure why, but the sight of the bird made the morning feel heavier. She had known ravens all her life. Noisy creatures, territorial, clever and loud. This one, though, seemed carved from silence. She listened. Nothing. Not even the faint hum that used to tremble along the wires. She walked down the steps and toward the fence, boots squishing in the wet soil. The raven followed her with its eyes. The silence stretched so far and so deep, it felt unnatural, as if the whole world were holding itself still just to avoid disturbing something it feared. Jonas arrived later than usual. His old pickup rolled down the road with its typical rattling cough, but even that sound somehow felt swallowed, muted in a way Marta had never heard before. When he stepped out, he looked uneasy. "You feel it too?" Marta asked before he said anything. Jonas rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, it's strange out here. The wires didn't hum all night," she said, "not once. I kept waking up to check." "You think something's wrong with the line?" She shook her head. "Electricity works fine. Radio works. But the air—" She hesitated, then finished quietly. "The air doesn't vibrate anymore." Jonas looked up at the raven. "Still there, huh?" "Still there." They stood in silence a moment longer. The wind pressed lightly against Marta's coat, but the wires above their heads didn't sway, didn't whisper, didn't sing. Jonas frowned and walked toward one of the poles, placing his hand against the wood. "It's solid," he murmured. "Nothing strange here." "Then why does everything feel wrong?" Marta asked. Before Jonas could answer, they heard a distant sound, the long wail of a train horn coming from the tracks beyond the hill. Marta exhaled. A normal sound, a familiar one. But the sound never reached them fully. It arrived thin, weakened, as though traveling through thick cloth. Jonas blinked. That's not right. The trains echo through this valley. Always have. As the horn faded, the silence returned instantly, swallowing its last note. The raven ruffled its feathers once, settling deeper onto the pole, as if comfortable in the stillness it commanded. Marta found her fingers tightening on the fence rail. "Jonas, do birds ever sit in one place this long?" "Sure," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Sometimes. But not like this." He didn't argue. They went about their chores, repairing a section of the barn roof, checking the cattle fence, sweeping out the feed room. Yet every movement felt strangely amplified in the quiet. Footsteps sounded too loud, tools clattered too sharply. When Marta dropped a bucket, the metallic clang echoed long after it should have faded. By noon, she couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The quiet was no longer just around them. It was inside her, in her pulse, in her breath, in the space behind her thoughts. She walked again toward the pole. The raven stared down at her, motionless. Not curious, not afraid, almost patient. "What do you want?" she whispered. The bird blinked once, slowly. The silence deepened, and then Marta noticed something new, a detail so small she would have missed it if she weren't already half obsessed with the stillness. A thin crack in the lowest wire, just a hairline fracture, as though the tension had gone out of it all at once. The wire sagged a little, lighter than the rest, almost slack. Her chest tightened. "Jonas." He was already walking toward her, his boots crunching heavily in the quiet. He saw the crack, his expression tightening. That shouldn't happen. Not overnight. Not without a storm. And there was no storm. They looked up at the raven together. The bird didn't move, but the quiet around it felt more deliberate now, as if it wasn't merely the absence of sound, but the refusal of it. Marta forced herself to turn away. "We'll call the power company," she said. "Someone needs to look at this." But the moment she said it, she felt something shift. Not in the wires, not in the air, but in the day itself. A weight settling in. A certainty. She knew deep down that no repairman would understand what was happening here. The silence was older than the poles, older than the wires, older than the farm, and the raven had not come by accident. That night, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Marta stood at her window watching the bird's dark silhouette against the dimming sky. The wires remained silent, utterly, impossibly silent. And for the first time, she wondered if sound would ever return. The third day began without a sunrise. Light simply appeared, thin, colorless, as though the sky were deciding reluctantly whether it wanted to wake at all. Marta had barely slept. Each time she drifted off, she woke again to the same thing. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the comforting village stillness she'd known all her life, but an unnatural quiet that felt like a lid pressed over the world. When she stepped out onto the porch, the air was colder than it should have been. Frost clung to the fence rails like thin white veins. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked immediately toward the telephone pole. The raven was still there, exactly as before, unmoved, unbothered by the cold. Its feathers glistened with morning frost, but the bird did not shiver. It simply watched the road, as if expecting someone or something to arrive. Marta exhaled slowly, her breath fogged in front of her. She listened again, hoping for even a faint tremble of the wires, but the poles stood lifeless. The lines hung straight and silent, as though they weren't connected to anything anymore. A pickup door slammed behind the barn. Jonas had arrived early, too early. She wasn't surprised. She guessed he hadn't slept well either. He walked toward her briskly, hands deep in his jacket pockets. "You hear anything yet?" he asked. "No." "Not even the low hum?" "Nothing," she said. "It's like the world's on mute." They walked together toward the pole. Frost cracked beneath their boots. The raven turned its head, following their movement. Jonas squinted upward. "Bird looks half frozen. Why doesn't it fly off?" Marta shook her head. "Maybe it doesn't need to." Jonas shot her a sideways glance. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. She didn't know how. All she knew was that the silence felt centered around that one bird, spreading outward like a ripple across the world. They continued their chores with little conversation. Jonas repaired a tractor wheel. Marta checked the chicken coop. But everything felt wrong. Every noise they made was sharp, almost brittle. Footsteps sounded like hammer strikes. Metal tools rang out too loudly. And between those moments of human noise came vast, heavy stretches of quiet air that swallowed everything whole. Around mid-morning, a strange thing happened. Marta was in the garden patch, pulling frost-bitten weeds, when she noticed movement on the road. A lone cyclist, a teenage boy from 2 farms over, pedaled toward them, bundled in a too-thin jacket. As he approached, Marta raised a hand to wave. The boy opened his mouth to call out, but Marta heard nothing. His lips moved, forming her name, but the space between them held only silence. She stepped closer, heart pounding. "Speak up! I can't hear you!" The boy frowned, confused, and tried again. No sound, not from him, not from the wind, not from the world. Jonas hurried over. "What's going on?" "I don't know," Marta whispered, her pulse hammering in her ears. "I can't hear him. At all." The boy blinked, pointed to his own ears, then shrugged helplessly. He could hear them. They could not hear him. Then, gradually, a realization crept over Marta, terrifying in its simplicity. The silence wasn't equal. It chose what it allowed. Her gaze drifted upward. The raven still sat on the pole, black against the gray sky. The boy gave up trying to speak and pedaled away, shaking his head. Jonas stared after him. Marta, I don't like this. I don't either. And you said the wires have been dead quiet since the bird came? Yes. Jonas swallowed hard. We should call someone. Marta shook her head. What would we even say? That a bird made the whole valley silent? He didn't argue. He only looked toward the pole again, face pale. The day dragged on. Cows refused to leave the barn. The dogs stayed under the porch, ears flat, tail tucked. Even the livestock sensed something was wrong with the air. In the afternoon, Marta went back to the pole alone. She stood beneath it for a long time, staring up at the raven. Its eyes were black, depthless. Not cruel, just aware. Why here? She whispered. Why my farm? The bird did not move. As she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her blood go cold. The fence behind her cast a long shadow across the ground. The pole cast one too. The raven did not. Just smooth frost where its shadow should have been. Marta backed away slowly, her mouth dry, her heart aching with a fear she had no name for. When Jonas found her later, she was still standing in the yard, staring upward, with a look he had never seen on her face. What happened? He asked. She forced herself to breathe. Jonas, she said quietly, I don't think the silence came because of the bird. He frowned. What then? She looked back up at the raven, dark, motionless, impossibly still. I think, she whispered, the silence brought the bird. And as she said it, the wires above them remained silent, as if listening. The fourth day arrived with a sky the color of dull tin, thick and unmoving. No sunrise, no shift of light, just a slow brightening, as though someone far above had turned up the dimmer switch on a gray world. Marta stepped outside wrapped in 2 layers of wool, though the cold that morning felt less like temperature and more like absence, as if the air had lost its warmth simply by forgetting how to hold it. She looked toward the telephone pole before her boots even touched the frost-hardened ground. The raven was still there, still motionless, still watching. Its feathers showed no ruffle from the night's wind. Frost dusted its back like powdered glass, but the bird did not shake it off. It perched like a carved thing, patient, unchanging, immune to the elements. Jonas was already in the barn when she reached it. He'd arrived before dawn, judging by the lantern still burning near the feed bins. He looked up when she entered, his face pale, his shoulders tense with sleeplessness. It's worse today, he said without greeting. I couldn't hear the tractor engine when I started it. Couldn't hear the latch on the barn door either. Had to watch it move to know it even closed. Marta nodded slowly. It's spreading. Spreading? Jonas's voice quivered. You think this is something alive? She didn't answer. Not yet. They stepped outside together. The farm dog followed them only to the threshold of the barn, then stopped, whining silently. Its jaws moved, its chest expanded, but no sound came out. Jonas knelt and touched its head. The dog pushed against him, trembling. Animals knew what humans tried to dismiss. The wind picked up, brushing the grass in waves. Marta watched carefully, expecting the wires above them to shiver, to hum, to respond. But they remained dead still, like lines drawn onto a canvas. Not a tremor, not a whisper. The silence had weight now, a presence, a pressure against the skin. By midday, the strange stillness grew even stranger. Marta was repairing a cracked window in the chicken coop when she felt sudden vibration beneath her feet. Faint, like a truck passing on a distant road. She froze, looking around. Jonas had felt it too. He stepped out of the barn, eyes wide. What was that? He whispered. The ground trembled again, more noticeable this time, enough to make dust fall from the rafters. A subtle, rhythmic thudding, almost like footsteps. Not fast, not heavy, but deliberate. Both of them turned toward the telephone pole. The raven had lifted its head. Not much, just a small tilt. But after days of perfect stillness, the movement was unmistakable. It looked down the line of poles, as if waiting for something to arrive along the wires. Marta felt her throat tighten. Do you hear anything? Jonas shook his head. I don't hear anything. Not even the vibration. But she could feel it, in the ground, through her boots, up her legs. A distant pulse, slow and steady, like something enormous moving beneath the earth or approaching from miles away. The cattle in the back pasture suddenly bolted, scattering across the frost with wide, silent eyes. The dog retreated under the porch. Even the chickens pressed themselves into the corners of their coop, wings tight against their sides. Jonas swallowed hard. Something's coming. Marta stared down the empty road, its cracked asphalt stretching toward the hills. There was nothing out there, yet the pressure in the silence kept building, as if the air itself were bracing. The raven opened its wings, just a little, just enough for the frost to fall from its feathers in a quiet, glittering arc. Jonas stumbled backward. God, it moved. Marta didn't move. She couldn't. The bird's wings, half spread, cast no shadow on the ground. The light passed through them like water through smoke. And then, a sound broke through the silence. Not loud, not sharp. A faint, trembling note that traveled along the telephone wires like a dying echo. Marta's breath caught. The wires... Jonas stepped closer, eyes wide. They're humming again? But they weren't humming. They were warning. The note wavered, shivered, then fell silent again, leaving behind an even heavier quiet, as though the world had exhaled in fear. The raven folded its wings slowly, carefully, and stared directly at Marta. Its black eyes held no malice, no hunger, no rage, only recognition, as though it had been waiting for her to understand something she wasn't ready to know. Jonas grabbed her arm. Marta, we need to leave. We need to get off this farm, now. She shook her head slowly. There's nowhere to go. What do you mean? The silence is growing, she whispered, her voice cracking. It isn't staying here. It's swallowing everything in its path. Far in the distance beyond the hills, the faint ground tremor grew stronger, a slow, steady heartbeat of something that had no sound, but made the earth remember its weight. The raven blinked once, long and deliberate. The wires above them went slack, as if surrendering. And Marta understood with a sudden, chilling clarity. The silence wasn't just a presence. It was an arrival. And whatever brought it was almost here.